You may be seated. Well, I'm sure all of you filled out tournament brackets for the Scripps National Spelling Bee that took place a couple of weeks ago. I'm also sure that all those brackets got busted since the winner was a 14-year-old Texan named Karthik Namani. Karthik was a wild card, you see. He hadn't even won a regional bee, so no Las Vegas odds maker would have picked him to win. Karthik's opponent in the finals was a 12-year-old girl named Nisa Modi. She faltered on the word Bewusstsein. And yes, I did spend almost as much time learning to pronounce Bewusstsein as I did writing the rest of this sermon. Anyway, the ESPN footage of the moment is gripping. The split screen shows Karthik nodding along earnestly with each letter until Nisa misses that pesky double S in Bewusstsein. He then begins nodding with that brilliant little head in wonder that his opponent could have gone down so easily. The championship was Karthik's to lose, and the word he's given to clinch this victory is koinonia. Now, this is where the results of the National Spelling Bee actually become unexpectedly good news for me personally. You may think I'm a better Christian than I am and think I was excited that people everywhere now know that koinonia comes from an old Greek term about Christian fellowship. It's what we've called our Wednesday night gatherings here at Calvary for a while. That's nice and all, but what really made me happy is that I now know I'm not the only one who can't spell what we call our Wednesday night gatherings here at Calvary. Apparently no one can but a 14-year-old savant in Texas. Finally, the National Spelling Bee made me feel a little less stupid. But what Karthik's victory also brought into a curious relief was a contrast. A contrast between koinonia, Christian community, and our obsession with brackets and championships and genius. We do love the elegant way a world of potentially everyone can get reduced down to the one person who does something better than anyone, right? And I know you're thrilled that a preacher finally had the courage to denounce the spelling bee industrial complex. But what I really want us to wrestle with today is this continued fascination of ours with the lone genius. We keep looking for someone who's so brilliant or strong or wealthy or beautiful or good or whatever we think is needed to repair what's wrong with the world. We keep looking for someone to save us from ourselves. And Scripture keeps warning us that we're setting ourselves up for trouble when we do that. The books of 1 and 2 Samuel tell of ancient Israel's transition from the rule of judges to the rule of kings. And as people who live in a modern liberal democracy, the story may seem to have very little to do with our lives. When we do risk infatuation with royalty, as with Harry and Meghan's wedding until it got buried in all that spelling bee news, when we get infatuated with royalty, it's more as a People magazine photo op than as a desire to organize our common life around a monarch. But even for moderns like us, there may be something timeless and familiar to the urge behind that desire of those ancient Hebrews for a king. You are old and your sons do not follow in your ways, said the elders to Samuel. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations. Initially, the request seems to be born of a little international peer pressure. Come on, Samuel, give us a king. All the cool nations are doing it. Samuel warns the elders that this monarchy thing will not go well. He says a king will make their sons horsemen and have them running before his chariots. He'll have them plow his ground and reap his harvest and make his implements of war. He'll make their daughters perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll basically take the best of everything they have and give it to his lackeys. And don't come running back to God when all this happens, Samuel adds. But the elders are resolute. They say, no, we are determined to have a king. We want him to govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. And to their credit, life with other people really can be difficult. Don't you want somebody to go out and fight your battles for you some days? But judges were something different. We remember Moses coming down from Sinai with those 10 commandments written in stone. We thought maybe the moral life of Israel seemed simpler at that time. 10's a good number. 1 commandment per finger, right? Never mind that they were in the act of violating commandment number 1 about not having other gods when Moses returned with the tablets. Oh well. But those 10 essential commandments were just the beginning, were they not? Living with other human beings is complicated work. Eventually, there were 613 laws guiding Israel's life together. And by the way, we Christians miss the point if we think 613 is just an unreasonably high number. Jesus did summarize the law in 2 great commandments, love God and love your neighbor. But in the real world, there's a whole lot of interpretive work to be done in figuring out what it means to love God and love our neighbor, given the circumstances of our lives. We could come up with 613 tricky ethical scenarios in need of interpretation in no time. And so in the Hebrew Scriptures, there were laws about worship and what to eat and how to stay clean. There were laws about feasts and festivals and sacrifices. There were laws about providing for the poor, about never charging interest on money you lend to someone in need, about not letting the sun go down before you've paid your worker his wages. There were laws about honoring the old and the wise. There were even laws about unloading a tired animal when its burden is too great, and one about what happens if your neighbor falls into the pit you dug and left uncovered overnight. To be ruled by judges was to bring all kinds of ordinary moral obligations to each other to the center. Not wealth or military power. Those are the obsessions of kings, as Samuel warned. To live by the law, interpreted by judges, was about building a meaningful common life, a life of fruitfulness and joy and justice, a life of compassion for the poor and welcome for the stranger and care for the earth. It was about building shalom, the peace God has intended for every generation of God's people. And like it or not, shalom requires judgment, not decrees. Shalom takes discernment, not edicts. Shalom takes a commitment to living together in a world where the right thing to do can seem ambiguous and uncertain, even a lesser evil at times. Shalom doesn't come about at the whim of a king. It must be built one ordinary human exchange at a time. And remember, Jesus' critique of the religion of his day was not that the law was too difficult. It was that the law wasn't doing the work it was meant to do in our lives. People were pretending to be champion law keepers, bracket winners in this holiness game. They thought the law made them special, separated them out, when the purpose of the law was to connect them in the most intricate and intimate ways every day of their lives. Last Wednesday, we convened a meeting of community leaders here at Calvary about Memphis' need for an emergency shelter for women. The numbers about this are shocking. 40% of people who are homeless are women. Memphis has about 24 safe, permanent emergency shelter beds for women. 24 beds, that's it. Creative ministries like Room in the Inn close that gap a little, but they don't close it anywhere close to completely. So it was very heartening to see a room full of people leave this place ready to make a change in these grim statistics. But today I'm thinking back to the days when judges ruled in Israel. Thinking about the way our obligations to the poor were not optional programs awaiting possible funding. They were written into the law, and satisfying the material needs of people were questions deliberated over by judges. It was illegal to glean to the edges of your own field. Judges could enforce your obligation to leave some of your harvest for the poor and for the alien who resides among you. I'm not arguing for any existing political system or structure. And there's plenty of the Old Testament law I find cruel and strange and obviously made for a way of life in a very different time and place. I'm just wondering what it would be like to live in a community in which the poor and the alien are clearly defined by the law within any definition of us. What would it be like to live in a land in which a woman could plead her case for food and shelter before her judge? What would it be like to live in a society where we began not with language about individual rights and independence from each other, but with shared moral obligations to one another's well-being, and built a way of life together from there? And what I wonder further is whether a people who lived and ordered their common life as if we are all deeply interconnected in God would begin to look for God differently too, searching not way up on sacred mountains or in the places of kings or the halls of wealth and power, but in all the simplest of human interactions, where two or three of us are gathered in His name, struggling to live as He taught us to. Jesus said He'd be among us. And that's a fairly astonishing thing to hear, especially from someone who stood before a kind of assistant king named Pontius Pilate one day and really couldn't find much of anything to say to him at all. I know we're fooling ourselves if we don't admit that there really are days when we just want a king or some kind of champion at life. Some days even a spelling champ might do, to go out for us and fight our battles. But maybe what we miss when we delegate so much to our heroes is God. Maybe we meet God in the ordinary little battles of our lives when we take them up together. Battles to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly. Battles to include the poor and the estranged and the excluded. Maybe we really do meet God not as we reign over whatever little kingdom we might have established for ourselves, but as we navigate our moral obligations to every human being with the best judgment we can muster, trying to make the best of a broken world, but having nothing less than the shalom of God as our ultimate goal. Amen.